Part 3. It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 21. The hall was completely silent. The temple guards all had strange looks in their eyes. The necromancer knocked down the entire audience with one spell. He was obviously someone not to be trifled with, and the temple was wrong in this matter. It was easy for the priest to reach a compensation agreement with the other party, and he was able to dodge the other party at a glance. This guy was so stubborn that it was wrong to pick on the other party's skeleton. Is this a disease? Little Pastor John opened his mouth, raised his hands, and quickly covered it. There was a whining sound in his mouth, and the freckles on his face were twisted so much that they almost bulged out. Spearman Raymond's mouth opened wide, Shield Warrior Vala's eyes widened, and Archer Tong's red hair was almost on fire. Little Gretel, wake up. This is the necromancer, the necromancer. What's wrong with you talking about skeletons with him? What a good child, everyone has grown up watching. How come he became so talkative after being enlightened by the god of nature? Priest Donald was lying on his back, being stepped on by the big cat, and did not dare to move at all. But the big cat on his body raised its head, and looked at Gretel with a pair of golden eyes, then at the golden skull, and flicked its tail, looking full of interest. With pets like this, the necromancer is naturally more interested. Take a step forward, look up at the skull's head, and then bend down to look at the pelvis. He looked left and right, but couldn't figure it out. He turned around and asked Gretel, "How do you think about this?" "It's easy." Gretel answered without thinking. "Well, look, this skull." The golden skeleton was quite tall, so Greet had to stand on tiptoes, which was a bit difficult. The golden skeleton turned its face and looked at him, then suddenly raised its hand to pick off its own head, holding the skull and handing it to Greet. Two flames danced in the black eye sockets, staring at him eerily in the palm of the skeleton's hand. "Gretel! You don't want to be like this, you are like this to me, Alexander." He tried to calm down. No matter how the skeleton can pick off its own head, the gender of the skull will never change. As long as it doesn't change, then he has something to say. Of course, the anatomy of aliens may be different, and that's another question. He did not reach out to pick it up, but turned a step to the side, pointed at the skull and talked. "Look at the forehead and top. This is an arc shape. If you are a woman, the forehead should be vertical and the top should be flat. Look at the eyebrow arch, it is obviously protruding and there are many small holes on the surface. Do you see it? For women, the eyebrow arch is not obvious and basically basic. There are no small holes. Look at the root of the nose." The content of forensic science that I learned and memorized in my junior year was eloquent and without any omission. Ordinarily, it should have been forgotten a long time ago. I forgot about it after taking the exam. Anyway, he studied clinical medicine and not forensic medicine. There is no need for such an unimportant subject to occupy memory. But now I think about it clearly, even which page, which line, and what the picture in the textbook is. Gretel even remembered the grimace he had drawn in the corner of the page. It seems that traveling through time does not come without its own benefits. Just a little happy carrot. Carrot. After traveling through time, there is one more hope of surviving smoothly. Good news always makes people feel good. Gretel unconsciously raised the corners of his mouth, and his speech speed when explaining to the necromancer and the golden skeleton became a little faster and his tone became gentler. Unknowingly, I had already taken on the airs of a superior doctor when I was teaching students in medical school. At this increase in speed, the skeleton's face showed no expression. It couldn't show any expression at all, except for the two flames in its skull, which went from flickering to absolutely still. It seems that he has completely given up and only regards himself as an emotional shelf. And in the eyes of the necromancer, there were clearly circles of ripples. His legs were wobbly, and he was about to be unable to support himself. Well, now that we've talked about the skull, let's take a look at the pelvis. Gretel stretched out his hand and poked the skull, and then poked it again. The skull reacted and hurriedly put its head back on. Greet nodded with satisfaction and lowered his head to observe his pelvis. This is the hip bone. The pubic symphysis is so wide and flat. The angle must be greater than 90 degrees. It is definitely a woman. Tisk, turn around and look at the back, and there are still traces this woman has given birth to a child. He lowered his head, and the necromancer also bowed his head. He bent down, and the necromancer also bent down. He bent over and twisted his neck to look up. The necromancer stood up straight, raised his left hand, and snapped his fingers. There was a rattle, and the golden skeleton that had been standing upright just now collapsed completely in front of Gretel. Gretel jumped back. How could this thing collapse if I go there? No more motivation? The magic is gone? But having said that, there are no joints, no ligaments, and no muscles on these bones. They should be collapsed instead of standing. As he thought about it wildly, he saw the pile of finger bones, ulna and radius, spine, thoracic vertebrae, cervical vertebrae, and ribs, automatically spliced together like slow motion in a demonstration animation. The spine is stacked upward piece by piece, the ribs are attached front and back, the outside of the shoulder blades, the arms and fingers are stretched out one by one. Finally, a half-headless skeleton with its upper body planted straight on the ground. One hand supported the ground, and the other hand fumbled twice, found his pelvis, and lifted it up unsteadily. Gretel. Is it because we are too tired of bending down and looking down, so we are tearing ourselves apart and holding up the bones for us to see? But this height is not enough. He looked at the necromancer, and the necromancer looked at him. After looking at each other for a moment, the necromancer snapped his fingers again, and the toes, tibias, and femurs of the golden skeleton began to be pieced together piece by piece. The lower half of the skeleton is standing on the ground. The upper half of the headless skeleton stretched out a hand, grabbed the femoral head and pulled hard, pulled itself up and lowered it upwards. One skeletal hand held up the pelvis, and the other skeletal hand fished in the ground, found the skull, and lifted it up exactly the same. Then, the upper half without pelvic support shook and fell to the side. Fell. Meow ouch 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 dash. A loud meow. Gretel turned his face and saw the black cat with white boots jumping off the priest's body with a light jump. The cat's tail slapped the ground, its paws pointed upward, and rolled all over the ground. Hey, laughing like this is too much. You are a cat? The necromancer's face was completely confused. He paused the bone staff in his hand and controlled the golden skull to return to its original shape. Then he pointed forward, and the stone door at the deepest part of the hall opened, revealing a passage. Then, the muscles on his face twitched, and he forced a smile. Go in and chat. Gretel nodded happily. The necromancer moved forward, the black cat wagging its tail to lead the way, the golden skeleton clicking at the end. After walking a few steps, the necromancer suddenly stopped and shouted coldly. You. No one can escape. Thanks to Wise Iwan for the 1000 starting coins. Thank you for the reward of 100 starting coins. Please collect, recommend, invest, book reviews. There are so few book reviews for the last few chapters, haven't you read them? It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 22. The sneaking movements of the temple guards immediately froze. The necromancer's bone staff paused and struck hard. Whisking, dozens of white bone pillars rose from the ground in the hall. The fallen temple warriors, Priest Donald, Roman knights, and several soldiers from Gretel's team were surrounded by 5 or 6 different fences, looking at each other from a distance. Gretel's eyelids twitched. We have known each other for a long time and met for the first time. Is this the bone cage? He looked carefully. Those bones were eerie and pale, each one more than 1 meter long, some even more than 1.5 meters long. Greet's interest immediately disappeared. It was not human bones, and it was not interesting. What kind of specific species is it? He is neither a forensic scientist nor a paleontologist. If you have time for this research, why not ask for a favor for your team and let the necromancer release them first? Well. Greet tried to speak. The necromancer had already interrupted. Don't worry, I won't kill them. I just don't want them to mess around. I will release them immediately early tomorrow morning. He waved his hand, faced the hall, and murmured. In the mysterious sound of the spell, Gretel seemed to see traces of black energy gathering inward. After a while, the gargoyle that had been chopped into pieces returned to its original state, got up and began to patrol. Here, there are gargoyles here, so it's safer for everyone to squat under the fence, and sleeping underneath also has the advantages of sleeping underneath. The wind can't blow, the rain can't hit, and the ground is spacious. Considering that this group of people had just smashed up the hall, Gretel couldn't say anything about how to deal with the necromancer. He glanced at each other with his teammates, and Reverend John and Brother Raymond were quietly waving their hands to him, signaling him not to speak. Greet felt relieved and followed the necromancer 2 steps forward. Suddenly he saw Priest Donald throwing himself on the fence and shouting. Wait. Treat him first. Let me treat him first. Otherwise he will die. Please. More than 10 steps away, the Roman knight was lying in another bone cage, unconscious and soundless. Next to him, the 2 warriors who were locked up were beating and shaking, but it had no effect at all. It only caused the knight to bleed more. Gretel was silent. To be honest, seeing Roman knight end up like this, he still felt a little happy. As for treating the knight, well, the collision just now shouldn't have caused brain hemorrhage or internal hemorrhage, and he would have died immediately, right? The necromancer turned to look at him. Seeing that Greet had no expression and no intention of interceding, he put on a straight face. No. The priest shrank. The necromancer didn't have much ill feelings toward him. Seeing his pitiful appearance, he stopped and thought for a moment. Have you brought any healing potion? Take it, take it. Priest Donald nodded. He took out 3 bottles of healing potion, stretched out his arms, and struggled to hand them out through the fence. The golden skeleton stepped forward to take the medicine bottle. The necromancer looked at the skeleton's hand, pointed at one of the bottles and said, "Pass it to him." The black cat jumped lightly, picked up the potion, and brought it to the cage where the Roman knight was. The 2 warriors were surprised and happy. They grabbed the potion and drank it for the Roman knight. The healing potion that the priest carried close to his body was not comparable to Little John's primary healing potion. As soon as the potion entered his throat, the knight's breathing became heavy. Groaning twice, he opened his eyes. My lord, you're awake." The 2 warriors were delighted. The Roman knight opened his eyes and saw the healing potion in front of him. He couldn't help but be overjoyed. He grabbed it and poured it on his wrist. "Don't!" Gretel blurted out. The Roman knight shook his hand and almost dropped the bottle, glaring angrily. "What are you doing?" Greet shrank reflexively after being shouted at. He didn't really want to get involved with the Roman knights in the first place, but he had been wandering in the sky before and was startled by the cries of the city guards, so he shouted out without thinking. After shouting, he faced the other party's angry eyes and continued. "You can't treat your wound like this, it's not enough to just treat the outside, you have to fix the inside first. Who listens to your nonsense?" The Roman knight snorted coldly, turned the bottle over, and carefully poured the healing potion on. As soon as the light golden potion fell, the wound on the wrist healed immediately, and the skin was smooth and clean, Exactly the same as before the injury. It's just that the thumb of the right hand is still slightly bent, and the shape is not very natural. Greet sighed, turned, and left. The necromancer watched their interaction with interest, smiled, and followed leisurely with the golden skeleton. The stone door closed behind them. The necromancer snapped his fingers, turned on the lights, and smiled at Greet. How? Do you want me to kill him for you? This. Gretel was stunned. This proposal was not without its allure. Gretel knew whose trick it was to recruit the city guards before, and the gargoyle did not fly above his head for no reason. But when it comes to killing that guy, do it? You really don't want it? The necromancer raised an eyebrow. He had brown hair and blue eyes, and was as thin as a stick. The raised eyebrows affected the muscles on his face, and he was no different from a ghost crawling out. Not to mention, his black cat with white boots made a light leap, jumped onto the shoulders of the golden skull, and stuck his head in to interject. That guy has no good intentions towards you. When I pounced on him, he was using you as a human shield. Gretel, cat can talk. Although this is a magical world where skeletons can walk and pick off their own heads, the black cat can talk. Greet couldn't help but stepped back until a chill ran down his spine and he pressed against the stone door. To be honest, he was a little afraid of cats in his previous life. There were 5 or 6 stray cats of various sizes in the hospital, and the nurses often fed them. Greet would never touch them in his previous life. When I ran here, I met another black cat with great fighting power, and it could also talk. Gretel supported the stone surface with his backhand. The black cat jumped down again and landed directly in front of him. The cat's tail slapped the ground, took a step forward, raised its head high, and bared its teeth. The cat's beard is translucent and curls up and down. It seems that because of Gretel's name, he is not in a good mood. How rude. I am the great Mr. Trochka. Don't call me Black Cat. Black Cat? Well, it's a creature that can talk, no, it's intelligent and can communicate. The adrenaline in Gretel's body surged for a while, then gradually calmed down. I'm not afraid that cats can talk, but I'm afraid that cats don't have the intelligence and fighting ability. If you don't say anything, just come up with a claw, and you're so big and so fast, then you'll have a headache. Forget it, this is a world of magic and divine arts. Skeletons can pick off their own heads, and cats can talk. Is it any wonder? Thanks to the countless animations he had watched and the various games he had played in his previous life, Gretel quickly accepted the setting of cats can talk. He took a step forward and nodded to the black cat politely. Hello, great Mr. Trochka. I was rude just now. I'm sorry. Hey, it's okay. The black cat waved his paw generously. When the paw was lifted up, the pink flesh pads purred, and Greet's fingers were eager to move, and he really wanted to pinch it. The black cat seemed to be particularly sensitive to this kind of evil intention. He quickly jumped away, raised his head, and grinned. Seriously, do you really don't want me to kill him for you? Need not. Gretel gradually calmed down. He stared down at the black cat's golden eyes, exhaled slowly, and raised a confident smile. That guy is already disabled. The wound will heal without pulling out the tendon and sewing it up. I reminded him. Who is to blame if he doesn't listen? Thanks to Wise Iwan for the 2000 starting coins. Continue asking for collections, asking for investment, recommended tickets, monthly tickets, book reviews, everything. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 23. Pa. Rhythmic applause broke out. Greed turned around and saw that the necromancer had already leaned his staff aside, smiling and applauding. After clapping his hands a few times, he stretched out his hand to Gretel, his tone a little more enthusiastic than outside. "I thought you were just a good old guy, but I didn't expect you are also a hacker. Ha 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 ha, dear friend, your insights are really impressive. I forgot to introduce myself just now. My name is Andrew Lin. I am a necromancer from Black Crow Swamp. And you? Ah, by the way, what would you like to drink? Do you want some mint water? Or honey water? Trochka dug out a beehive a few days ago, and I'm telling you, he probably beat it, and he just beat away the brown bear that was robbing the honey. The speed of speaking is really fast, and the topics jump very quickly, one after another flying out along with the associations. Suspected of having a wandering mind, this man should probably see a psychiatrist. If there were psychiatry in this world. Greet made a mental note silently. The expression on his face remained unchanged, and he answered with a smile. I'm Greet Nordmark, a local. It's hard to say what my occupation is right now. Please have some mint water. Do you have anything to eat? I'm so hungry when I get up to work in the middle of the night. Tlicka. Andrew the necromancer shouted. The golden skeleton clicked away, while the necromancer finished washing his hands and turned around enthusiastically. Hey, so do you think it would be easier to control the skeletons if they use their own bones? I think your skeleton is already very obedient, Gretel replied sincerely. He kept staring at the golden skull. Compared with the black cat who was doing nothing, lying on the table waiting for food, the skeleton has been busy since he came in. Go through the cabinet, get the tray, get the tea set, pour water and get food. Actually, a stone slab was turned over with a click, and the flames started to rise on it, and the waffles were baked hot. If it wasn't a skeleton, he would have believed it if it was a robot. Obviously, Necromancer Andrew was not satisfied with this answer. He gesticulated and described how incompetent his skeleton was in combat. Gretel, no, much better than me, and looked at Greet longingly again, waiting for his answer. I do not know. Greet struggled to swallow these words. But this question is too difficult to ask. If you ask me, let me ask you where your skeleton is. He tried to smile. I think the skeletons may not know which bone is its own. Yes, yes, the man nodded vigorously. This set of bones is made by itself. It seems really unreliable. So how do you look at these bones? How do you tell which bone belongs to whom? Gretel. Should I not accept the invitation? Although this necromancer doesn't look malicious, he seems to have a bad mind. Greet looked around, a little flustered. How to tell which bone belongs to whose? He does have a way, such as doing a DNA test. Each bone is done once and classified according to the results. It is absolutely fast, accurate, high quality and low price. The problem is this is another world. He really wants to do it, but there have to be conditions for him to do it. There are also less accurate classification methods. For example, based on the time it takes for the epiphysis to heal, the age of the owner of this bone can be distinguished, and then those with different ages can be separated. For example, the epiphysis of the small head of a radius bone has healed, but the lower end epiphysis has not yet healed, while the epiphysis of another hip bone has completely healed. The radial head heals between 15 and 17 years old, and the lower epiphysis heals between 16 and 18 years old. Taking all factors into consideration, the owner is approximately 16 to 17 years old. The hip epiphysis heals between 20 and 25 years old. Since it is completely healed, it means that the owner must be over 20 years old. These two bones must belong to two people, no need to ask. However, the observation of epiphyseal lines requires X-rays. There is no other world. Greet, the former emergency doctor, Nodmark, once again cried from the bottom of his heart and fell to the ground. Someone get me an X-ray machine. If that doesn't work, I can get some radium ore and I can find someone to rub it by hand. Necromancer Andrew was still looking at him eagerly. His face was sallow, his hair was greasy, and he looked like he didn't pay attention to personal hygiene at all. As for the figure, even without the wind blowing it looks like a stick. If he gets thinner, he can be brothers with his skeleton. By the way, the golden skeleton was holding a tray of kettles, porcelain plates, cups, and glass jars, with mint, water, white bread, and honey on it. Standing next to the cabinet, chest raised, head raised, arms flat, the posture is quite standard, but it doesn't come over. Is this a rhythm where you don't have anything to eat, and you don't even have snacks? Gretel drew circles and complained about the necromancer in front of him. The situation was stronger than his own, so he could only search with cocaine, search the forensic medicine textbook stored in his mind, and try to get some useful information. Actually, the age of bones can also be identified. For example, the skull and teeth are obvious signs. Gretel stopped and looked around, trying to find a skull for live teaching. It's a pity that although this is the residence of the necromancer, bones are not everywhere. At least, Greet looked around and saw only that one. The one with the golden skull. So, the skeleton that he looked at eagerly came over with a click. First put down the tray, pour the mint water, put the dessert plate, and then take off your head, hold it in both hands, and hand it to Gretel. The dark eyes were raised upwards, with two soul fires in them, staring at Gretel's big eyes and small ones. Gretel. What is this? What do you mean by this? Do you want me to hold a muffin with one hand, spread honey on it, eat it in my hand, and give you a lecture by poking your skull with the other hand? Even if surgeons are generally informal, dare to face the dripping blood, and are used to facing the bleak life, they would not be so rough. He leaned back to avoid the skull that came under his nose. He reached across the table, took a fork from in front of the necromancer, and struck the skull hard. Open your mouth. The upper and lower jaws of the golden skull opened in response. Gretel raised the necromancer's fork, pointed at the black and uneven teeth, and explained one by one. The older you get, the greater the wear and tear. Look, the tips of the teeth are worn away, and the crowns of the big teeth at the back are worn away, and the dentin is exposed. Tisk 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 tisk, it must have been very painful when he was alive. If the crown is worn away just a little, or the cusp is not smoothed, the person will be younger. As he spoke, Necromancer Andrew stretched his neck and looked at each one by one. The body leaned further and further forward, and the head was buried lower and lower, as if it was about to be buried in the big mouth of the skeleton. Halfway through, he suddenly came back to his senses and waved his hand casually to the table. Please. Greet was not polite, and showed off the eating speed of an emergency doctor during the night shift. He grabbed the muffin with his left hand, poured the honey with his right hand, and put the two pieces into his mouth as soon as he put them together. Putting the first bite in, flicking the tip of the tongue on the roof of the mouth, he couldn't help but let out a light tut. Well, the waffles are delicate and plump, the honey is sweet, and the mint water is refreshing. Although the skill of the golden skull in baking waffles is not as good as that of the chef in his previous life, it is still delicious enough in the middle of the night when he is hungry. This is what people should eat. I don't want to eat brown bread every day. He was in a happy mood and the content of his lectures became richer. Oh, the degree of tooth wear is not only related to age, but also related to the owner's eating habits and economic status. For example, people who often eat black bread will definitely have more tooth wear than people who often eat white bread. In addition to teeth, the pelvis can also be used to judge age. Pelvis. Thanks to @Kenji's IOFAN for the 100 starting coin reward. Asking for collection, asking for investment, asking for recommendation votes, asking for monthly votes, asking for book reviews. It was so difficult to write today. I wrote, deleted, and deleted. I deleted a chapter 3 times and still haven't finished it. Please comfort me. It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 24. A necromancer, a former deputy chief physician of the emergency department, discussed the bones endlessly, and it seemed that they had met at a late date. After chatting for half a night, necromancer Andrew Lin got carried away for a moment. He reached out across the table and grabbed Gretel's wrist. "Dear friend, you are really suitable to become a necromancer. How about joining us in Black Crow Swamp? I can introduce you." "Correct. I'm going to ask my mentor. My mentor is an 11th level archmage. When he breaks through the boundaries in the future, he might help you become a lich." "Gretel. Thank you, I didn't really want to. I feel like I haven't lived enough." However, the necromancer's suggestion is not without its attractions. Gretel flipped his wrist and held the other person's hand hard. "I am more interested in elemental magic. Mr. Lin, you have mentioned the Mage Tower and the Magic Council before. Can you recommend them to me?" "Ah, elemental magic, elemental magic." The necromancer stretched out his arms exaggeratedly. With his head raised to the sky, his tone of voice was ups and downs, as if he was singing a cadenza of an opera. Everyone likes elemental magic. At least, they also choose alchemy and summoning. As for the poor undead faction, every time they invite people, they will hear this answer. "Dear Mr. Lin, I prefer elemental magic. Dear Mr. Lin, I prefer alchemy." Except for those who have the deepest sorrow and want to resurrect their loved ones, no one, no adult, will choose the great necromantic magic. Gretel is embarrassed. People possessed by drama spirits are interesting to watch from a distance, but really stressful up close. He dodged the spittle sprayed by the necromancer, his brain was spinning at full speed, and he was thinking wildly. Is this guy a showman? Or is it a manic episode? Is there any other phenomenon that can support the running thoughts I just observed? Will necromancy magic affect human hormone secretion and thus affect people's mental state? There is no place to do an electroencephalogram in Breaking the World, and there is no way to do a biochemical routine or anything like that. If it's inconvenient. Convenient. Of course it's convenient. Master Lin An took a step forward enthusiastically. Gretel couldn't dodge, so he grabbed his arms and spat spit into his face. Although the Northman who presides over the Mage Tower is fat, irritable, and loves to drink, he once explored the hall straight with me and fought against the iron shell of the Church of Radiance. Dear friend, you don't worry, with my letter of recommendation, he will never refuse to accept you. The necromancer rolled up to the desk like the wind, spread out the parchment, and waved it away. Take it. Thank you so much. It's a trivial matter, Lin An waved his hand proudly. He glanced outside the door, suddenly laughed mischievously, and approached Gretel. By the way, that knight's hand is really broken, isn't it? Can't it be cured? He didn't sew the tendons. Greet spread his hands. Can you cure it? Greet hesitated for a moment, neither nodding nor shaking his head. He can do hand tendon sutures and other things if he really wants to, but the main thing is hand surgery. This surgery is delicate, tendons, blood vessels, and nerves are sutured one by one, and it can only be done well with a microscope. After a few hours of doing this, when I took off the microscope, everything was spinning. Moreover, there is no microscope in this broken place, and there is no special needle and thread for microsuturing. Although the treatment effect is better than no treatment, it can be imagined. Besides, he wasn't good at this job. Gretel clearly remembers that when he was in school in his previous life, he could only sew 4 or 5 mousetails in one class. The blood vessels in mousetails are about the same thickness as the blood vessels in his hands, making them the cheapest material for practicing basic skills. The strongest student in the class was the guy who was later snatched away by the hand surgery department, with the highest record of 12. However, in the eyes of Necromancer Lin, Gretel did not deny it, it was obviously affirmative. The necromancer's eyes brightened. Then how are you going to treat him? Otherwise, I drag him in and you treat him on the spot. No anesthesia, no disinfection, no hemostasis, just start right? This is too rough and absolutely not allowed. Gretel opened his mouth, not knowing how to answer, or where to start. However, the necromancer had already taken action. With a wave of his hand, the stone door that separated the hall and the inner room opened again, and the black cat jumped down to the ground. Gretel saw a black light flash before his eyes. The black cat named Mr. Trochka was still of normal size when he jumped up, but became the size of a lynx when he landed. When he rushed to the door, he was as big as a leopard. Amidst the deep roar of the beast, there was a loud sound of bones breaking, followed closely by the screams of the Roman knights. "Let me go, let me go." The Roman knight kept struggling, and the sound got closer and closer. There were exclamations in the hall. I don't know how many people were alarmed by this incident. Priest Donald's voice was particularly loud. "Let him go. Master Mage, please let him go. Gretel. Gretel." Gretel was stunned. 2 days after arriving in another world, he was pushed to the ground, had a sword pointed at his throat, was forcibly recruited, and attacked by monsters. He experienced more dangers than he had experienced in the past month or even a year. However, there has never been a moment that made him feel as cold as now. A few hours ago, the person who was so high above him and could even threaten his life was now being dragged in by a demon pet, just because the necromancer was curious and wanted to see some surgeries he had never seen before. People are knives and servants, and I am fish and meat. But in such a world, one moment's swords may become fish meat the next moment. How can it be said clearly? Isn't this bad? Greet's head shook like a windmill. The necromancer thought he had a grudge against the knight and was unwilling to treat him, so he tried to persuade him. Treat him and let me see. At worst, you cure him first, and then I make a stroke with your palm. Greet sweated profusely and continued to shake his head. My head was buzzing, and I felt like the 6 small bones in my ears were shaking out. Don't you want to kill someone? Then, cure him first and then cut off his tendons. Within 2 words, the black cat, which transformed into a leopard, had already arrived in front of the stone gate with the knight in its mouth. At the critical moment of life and death, the seriously injured knight unleashed his greatest potential, clutching the edge of the stone door with both hands. He raised his head and stared at Gretel, his eyes filled with resentment and despair. Click. The edge of the stone door broke at the knight's fingertips. Gretel trembled all over. No. He turned around, took a step across, and stood in front of the necromancer. Looked directly into the other person's eyes with a firm gaze. I will not do such a thing. I have sworn that I will never harm anyone with my medical skills. Thanks to @Balalala for the tip of 100 starting coins. Please continue to invest, there are still 21 left to reach 100, and then there will be a small promotion, please, please. It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geolan 2020. Chapter 25. The necromancer's expectant smile froze on his face. He glanced at the struggling Roman knight, then turned back and stared at Greet quietly. Snow-white light surged down from the roof, illuminating the shadows under his eye sockets and cheekbones that were unusually thick, making his skinny and thin face look more and more like a skeleton. Gretel's heart trembled. The opponent is a necromancer, who is much stronger than him, and a pet next to him can defeat him. If you refuse his request, will you be tied up and dissected? Greet's heart was shaking, and cold sweat broke out on his back, but he looked at the necromancer without flinching. Clench your fists tightly, pin your knees back hard, and keep your legs from shaking. Doctor's principles must still be maintained. It is absolutely unacceptable to arbitrarily operate a knife on a patient for selfish reasons. Gretel's expression was too firm and her eyes were too clear. Necromancer Lin looked at him for a moment, shrugged and waved. The black cat turned back with the knight's head in its mouth, and threw the man into the bone prison again. The stone door is closed. All the yelling, exclamations and rejoicings were shut out of the door. Necromancer Lin glanced at the stone door and looked at Gretel again. But what if he hurts you? I will fight back. Greet replied proudly. After a pause, he added. But, I will never use my medical skills to harm anyone. That was the oath I made on the day I became a medical student in my previous life. Lin was silent. He looked at Greet's lively young face, was lost in thought for a moment, and sighed. I used to have a friend who, also thought like you. And later, after I became a necromancer, I avenged him. Sorry. Greet apologized quickly. After thinking about it, I tried to find a supplement. How about I do the tendon suturing operation again and show it to you? Just give me an animal, a bigger one. Aha! Lin En was happy. Half an hour later, Greet also began to beam with joy. On the platform in front of him was a live sheep that Mr. Trochka had snatched from nowhere. It was bleeding. On the small table on the side, there is a row of surgical tools, scalpels of various sizes, surgical scissors, retractors, drills for drilling holes. Although the sharpness of the blade cannot be described in words, and disinfection is even more difficult to think about, but after all, it is a surgical instrument. He touched the scalpel again. Happiness index add 1, add 1, add 1. Can these be used? Lin looked at him eagerly. Greet touched all the equipment one by one, looked up at the roof, and sighed. Lack of something. Tell me what I'm missing. Loop needle, electric knife, forget it, just burn one with the soldering iron and forget about the needle holder. Oh, I'm so used to it. Get me 2 more needle nose pliers. If you don't have pliers, tweezers will do. Prepare the skin and clean it. Gretel picked up the skin of the lamb leg with the forceps of his left hand. He held the handle of the scalpel between his thumb, middle finger, ring finger, and little finger. He pressed his index finger on the back of the knife and began to narrate. Then, this way of holding the knife is the bow holding method. Why is it called the bow holding method? That's it, is there a violin in this world? Gretel's mind was racing. Forget it, if you don't have a violin, you still have a morinkuur, and if you don't have a morinkuur, you might still have an urhu. In short, every nation in the world has some kind of harp for playing. Gretel made a quick gesture. This is how to hold a piano bow. Holding the knife like this will have greater cutting force. It is usually used to cut through skin and muscles. Really? I'll take a closer look. Lin's big furry head stuck out. A large shadow immediately fell on the leg of lamb under Greet's knife, making it impossible for him to see anything clearly. Hey, step back a little, Tisk, I still can't see clearly. Your lighting is not good. Can you get a shadowless lamp? What? There are also shadowless lights. Greet had to put down the scalpel and satisfy Lin's curiosity first. After 1 hour of writing and drawing, and the other knocking, the most peculiar shadowless lamp in Greet's impression was built above the operating table. The 4 white bone arms are centered on the spine and cross each other to form a cross. Each of the 4 hands holds 2 ribs, forming a large circle for 2 people to embrace. Dozens of skeletal hands are densely hung in the circle, and each skeletal hand holds an enchanted glow stick. Gretel. Well, at least the light source meets the requirements, right? Moreover, the skeletal hand holds the fluorescent stick and hangs it upside down. In any case, it is easier to adjust the direction. He performed the operation painfully all night under the shadowless lamp. Cut the tendon, use tweezers to pull out the retracted tendon from deep within the muscle, stretch, reshape, and heal with healing surgery. Continue to dissect, continue to sew, and finally slaughter the poor sheep. The two of them and the cat happily drank a pot of sheep soup. The next morning, Greed was reluctantly sent out by the necromancer carrying 2 suitcases. One box contains surgical instruments that have been used before, and the other box is much more expensive. Each piece is placed in a red velvet-lined grid, crystal clear and made entirely of glass. Beakers, flasks, crucibles, stirrers, balances. It is a set of basic alchemy tools. There are no medicinal materials or powders in the box, but this set of alchemy tools alone is already valuable. Greed was a little uneasy. This is too expensive. No, this is nothing. My friend the necromancer shook his head vigorously. There is a proverb among mages, no knowledge is priceless. Last night, you generously shared so much knowledge with me, please allow me to share something with you. These little gadgets . He waved his arm and drew a big circle above the suitcase. Every mage should have a set. Everyone. My dear friend, believe me, as long as you join our school, you will get much more refined tools than this. Much more refined? Do you have a microscope? Is there a centrifuge? Do you have a UV spectrometer? If that doesn't work, just give me a pipette. Gretel complained silently. Since he didn't have anything, he might as well find a way to save it himself. Relatively speaking, it is obviously more important to join the school of thought that you are interested in. My sterilization cabinet, my petri dishes, my equipment for separation, purification, analysis, and synthesis of various pharmaceuticals, my X-ray B ultrasound and nuclear magnetic resonance. School of Elements, School of Alchemy, it's up to you. Gretel was immersed in beautiful hope. Necromancer Lin walked beside him, chattering persuasion. By the way, he glanced at Gretel and the box in his hand, wishing that he and the box could be snatched back to the Black Crow Swamp. Dear friend, are you really not considering joining our school? Really, as long as you nod, I will immediately send you back to see my mentor and ensure that you enjoy the treatment of an official mage. You have to know, even if you take me if you go to the mage tower in the city, you can only start as an apprentice. But I'm really interested in the elemental mage. Thanks to @2999999 for the 100 starting coins. The ranking dropped to number 21 on the new light novel list, and it has already fallen off the first page. Today's addition to the collection is so miserable, I'm crying. The necromancer and his cat are obviously very cute, right? Please collect, recommend, and review books. Please invest. There are still 20 people who have invested over 100 UN. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 26. Gretel took the recommendation letter and went straight to the Mage Tower. The temple search team showed off its power and retreated in disgrace. Before they reached their destination, they had already offended a necromancer, and the strongest fighter in the team was seriously injured. Seeing that there was nothing better to do by moving forward, we could only retreat to the temple for repairs and treatment. As for whether the next step is exploration, revenge, or something else, that is all a matter for the future. Even Priest Donald, who originally wanted to chat with Gretel, could only look at him with regret, boarded the carriage and drove away without looking back. The temple guards have all withdrawn, so naturally they will no longer care about the city guards. Gretel discussed it with his teammates, returned to Uncle Edmund's farm, and met up with Captain Cullen. I borrowed some mounts from Uncle Edmund, took a small road and headed straight back to the city. The temple guards suffered such a big loss, and there was no guarantee that they wouldn't vent their anger on others. If the reason for their failure was put on them, they would definitely not be able to handle it with just a few soldiers at the lowest level. The plan for now is to return to camp as soon as possible and report to the superiors. Even John, the young priest of the Ares temple, cancelled his visit home and turned back to the temple. Greet separated from them as they approached the city and turned toward the Mage Tower. Heartland City has one and only one Mage Tower, which is not inside the city but stands on the top of a hill in the suburbs. There are dense woods on the hills. If you raise your head, you can only see a little bit of the tower spire in the distance. Does this mean the ancient temple hidden in the mountains? It has a bit of an artistic conception. Gretel muttered and shook the reins. The little chestnut mare under the seat snorted, turned her head obediently, and walked up the mountain path. The road out of the city branched off into a branch road at the bottom of the hill, leading directly to the top of the mountain. This mountain road is wide and flat, and has deep ruts. It is obvious that carriages often come and go. Greet walked without difficulty, and in less than a quarter of an hour he reached the top of the mountain and arrived in front of the Mage Tower. The Mage Tower has the word tower in its name. It is actually similar to a castle, with a wall surrounding the boss. Gretel jumped off the horse, took a few steps back outside the fence, and looked up. This tower is quite tall, 3 or 4 floors. Boom! There was a loud bang. Birds flew away in fright, horses neighed, and the thick Mage Tower shook twice. Thick smoke billowed out of the window on the 4th floor, and at the same time, there was a whistling sound, and a person flew out in a parabola shape. Gretel! This height? This speed? If you hit the ground, if you're lucky, you'll get a broken bone. If you're not lucky, your neck will hit the ground. You can delete your account and practice again on the spot. He let go and ran towards the landing point. If he breaks his leg, there is no need for him to rescue him. If he breaks his neck, resuscitation will be of no use. If he falls and causes cardiac arrest, airway obstruction, fracture, or massive bleeding, etc., if he runs faster, he might be able to get a life back. Run faster! Run faster! Greet huffed and ran, almost faster than he could push an endangered patient to the operating room. He ran, taking each step slower than the last step. Finally, he stood on the same spot with his knees propped up and his head raised blankly. It's not that I can't run anymore. Gretel's current body is still a new recruit of the city guard, and his warrior level is barely above level 1. The problem is that every move of the man thrown out of the window made Gretel feel that running like this was unnecessary. The man danced, screamed, and flew out in a parabola. When he reached the highest point, he suddenly took something out of his pocket and threw it out. Immediately afterwards, the high-speed flying trajectory suddenly stopped, and the whole figure seemed to be covered with a parachute, slowly, falling to the ground. Greet held the reins and stood on the ground with his mouth wide open to watch. The guy was floating, swaying, from 3 feet to 2 feet above the ground, and then from 2 feet to 1 foot. He lowered his head and saw Gretel and smiled at him. Elliot! A roar sounded above the smoking window. The person floating in the air shivered, and somehow stopped floating. With a plop, he fell straight down. Can you still leave? This flying man with a black and grey face, the bomber of the Mage Tower, the strong man who floated down from the sky and finally twisted his feet, finally returned to the Mage Tower sitting on Gretel's little mare. With his introduction, Gretel easily met the owner of the Mage Tower, the 5th-level magician Geerman Kraus, and handed him the necromancer's letter. Gret Nordmark, Herman was exactly the opposite of the necromancer. He was a fat man with a crimson robe tied around his belly and a huge belly. His dark brown forehead hair was neatly combed back, and a long beard extended from his ears to his chin, and then drooped down fluffily, covering his Adam's apple. Gretel glanced over, almost mistakenly thinking that he had traveled through time again and saw someone in the political textbook with his own eyes. He stood beside him with his hands down. Master Hermann finished reading the letter at a glance, raised his eyes, and glanced at Gretel from top to bottom. Andrew said you wanted to learn elemental magic. Yes. How was your previous foundation? How many levels of spells can you release? Level 1 spells. Level 0 spells. No way. How much have you read about the principles of magic, basics of spells? Construction of magic patterns. Primary understanding of elements. Potion science. You don't even know magic words, do you? I really don't know this. Gretel's head dropped lower and lower. When it comes to Latin, he knows a few. He memorized the names of medicines when he was studying medicine. He also has a minor in German. He often uses English to publish journals and read literature, and he is even more familiar with it. But where did he know about magic words and that kind of thing? However, not knowing magic words means that most, or even most, magic books cannot be understood. No, after studying hard for so many years, I actually became illiterate after traveling to another world. Seeing that he didn't understand this or that, Master Hermann's thick eyebrows frowned again and again. Even with a recommendation from a friend, he became impatient. You don't even know common words, do you? I know this, Gretel breathed a sigh of relief and quickly answered. Thanks to the original owner's father, although he died young, he taught the original owner how to read. There was even a small box of books left at home. The original owner relied on this box of books to complete the most basic reading education. And I know healing skills. Well. Master Gearman's expression brightened slightly. Being able to heal means that you have the basic qualifications of a spellcaster, and your mental power, perception, etc. are at least up to par. As for the rest, well, for the sake of my friend Lynn. Since it was Andrew who wrote the recommendation, you should first attend the Mage Tower. The tuition fee is 10 gold coins per month. For Andrew's sake, I will waive it for you. Thank God. Greet secretly breathed a sigh of relief and nodded hastily. 10 gold coins per month, but now he can't even touch a silver coin from his whole body. The salary of the city guard seems to be 5 silver coins per month. Fortunately, he was exempted. Otherwise, would he go back to the necromancer to borrow money? Well, you can come to the Mage Tower every day and read the books on the first floor freely, but you are not allowed to copy or take them away. You can come and listen when I teach. If my disciples, Elliot, and others are willing, you can also ask them for advice. You must prepare your own materials to copy spells. You cannot use the alchemy room without my permission. We can discuss the rest of the matter after you become a mage apprentice. Thanks to Ed for the 200 starting coins reward for a bowl of fish ball porridge. Please invest, please support. It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 27. How is it going? As soon as Greet walked down the foot of the mountain, his companions gathered around him and asked eagerly. Gretel lowered his head, a little frustrated. Master Gearman said, "Let me listen first." He lowered his head and recounted the negotiation process. To his surprise, all the companions were very excited, especially Captain Cullen and the little priest John. Captain Cullen was well informed and was the first to comfort him. This treatment is already very good. Little Greet, you don't know how many children of noble families in the city are not qualified to enter the magic tower to observe. And tuition is free. The young pastor values this more. He even cited the experiences of his companions to comfort Greet. In our temple alone, there are many descendants of nobles and knights. Because they cannot afford to learn magic, they can only come to the temple to practice. Can't afford to learn magic. Gretel forced a smile. Tuition fees for auditors are free, but you need to bring your own materials to copy spells. You don't have to pay extra to listen to Master Hermann's lectures. You can ask his disciples for advice. God knows whether they will be willing to give advice without paying. When eating, he could lower his face and only eat black bread. He travels between the city and the Mage Tower every day. Is it possible to run on 2 legs? Everything costs money. The original monthly salary was only 5 silver coins. After having a full stomach, even clothes can only be bought in burlap. Greet's heart was full of sorrow, but he didn't dare to express it, lest Uncle Karen and the others would become worried. He rode into the city with the team and walked toward the military camp. He observed the streets in the city along the way, and the more he looked, the more worried he became. The city guard's barracks was near the north gate. Gretel and the others entered from the west gate and walked around half a circle. Although the streets they walked through were not the most prosperous, they were not considered too popular. However, as far as Greet could see, there were dilapidated wooden houses on both sides of the street, with leaky doors and windows, crooked. The woman's skirt was covered with patches. Greet saw a 6 or 7-year-old little girl in a wooden house looking out from the doorframe. When she saw him looking over, she shyly shrank back and then quietly poked her head. The hem of the girl's clothes was in tatters and could only cover half of her thighs. The younger boy was playing in the corner with his bare buttocks. The bakery on the corner of the long street almost always sells black bread. The streets are not paved, there are no sewers on either side, and there are no public health facilities. Garbage is piled up in disorder, sewage flows across the river, and horses' hooves step down, leaving a mud puddle. Black, and yellow mud spots kept splashing. Gretel didn't want to think about what was in the mud. In one word, poor. Gretel had no idea how much money he could earn to support himself in such a poor city. I hope the military camp can be a little more helpful. No, even if it is helpful, it has nothing to do with him. How can it give him a promotion and a salary increase? From now on, if he stays in the Mage Tower every day, it will be good if the city guards don't fire him. Gretel was filled with anxiety and followed Captain Cullen into the military camp. The original owner still had a picture of what the military camp looked like. However, after actually entering, he was slightly shocked. The size of Heartland City's city guard is not large. There are only about 200 people, which is not as large as a county public security bureau in the previous life. Of course, God knows whether the population of a small town can catch up with a county in its previous life. It's not small to say the least. After all, 200 people gather, train, and compete in this venue every day. Gretel has already seen how capable the knights are in the Roman Knights. The place is small and there really isn't enough space for them to deal with. Such as right now. On the training ground, which was larger than the school playground, 2 knights were fighting with smoke billowing out. The roar of weapons clashing could be heard by Gretel from half the training ground. Captain Cullen stopped immediately. The captain and Knight Zero are fighting. Our squadron leader is also here, let's go over there. There are 200 people in the city guard. There is one captain, Stephen Nolan, a level 7 knight. The 4 squadron captains all have knight strength, and according to the warrior level, they are level 5 upwards. Greet vaguely remembered that before his father died in battle, he was also the squadron leader of the city guard. As for old warriors like Uncle Karen, whose strength has never been able to break through the knights, and who are getting older and their bodies have begun to decline, they can only remain as squad leaders. The squadron that Cullen's team belongs to, the squadron leader Flynn Knight, looks to be in his mid-30s, in the prime of life. After listening to Captain Karen's report, he glanced in the direction of the Spring Goddess Temple and sneered. What do they say? Do you think our city guards are just bullying you? Greet felt relieved. Flynn Knight waved him forward and asked with a smile. Have you mastered the art of healing? Do you want to learn magic? How many times a month? Master Gearman allows me to go every day, Gretel answered honestly. After finishing speaking, he hesitated for a moment, with a look of embarrassment on his face. Captain Flynn, can I ask you to? What? Flynn Knight asked with interest. Gretel tried not to blush. That's right, I have to go to the Mage Tower to read a book these days and I can't participate in patrols. Can you? Don't deduct your salary for the time being. Not going to work for a long time, not taking a paid vacation, but still wanting to receive salary, this was something that had never happened in Greet's previous life. He was so embarrassed that he hesitated and finally finished his words, but he heard Flynn Knight burst into laughter. Little Gretel, you. Gretel was stunned. Flynn Knight laughed, even tears came out of his eyes, and he stretched out his hand to wipe it away. You're actually worried about salary deductions. Silly boy, you, ha 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 ha. This burst of laughter was astonishing. The two knights fighting on the field were also distracted. Knight Zero was slow to block and was knocked away with a bang. Ah! The onlookers screamed. A group of people ran inside. Gretel had only run a few steps when he heard someone shouting. Pastor! Call the pastor! The tone of voice was urgent and sad. It was exactly the same tone as when the family members shouted doctor in the emergency department in the previous life. Greet quickened his pace even more. He rushed into the crowd, peered through the crowd, and his breathing suddenly became tight. The wounded man huddled on the ground, his lips were bruised, and his hands reached toward his chest. His eyes were as wide as a goldfish's, and he opened his mouth forcefully, sucking in air as if he was about to be suffocated. The veins on his neck bulged like earthworms, and he was sweating profusely and struggling hard. This is... Take off his clothes. Take them off quickly. Without him saying a word, the soldiers beside him were already ripping off the wounded man's clothes. It is almost the consensus among soldiers that patients with trauma should take off their clothes as soon as possible to facilitate treatment by the priest. As soon as the clothes were taken off and the injury came into his eyes, Gretel immediately frowned. The wounded man's chest twisted unnaturally. The ribs were broken, the chest wall collapsed, and the stubble of bones pushed up the skin diagonally. What's even more dangerous is that the right side of the chest is unusually full. The distance between several ribs is obviously widened. Between exhalations and inhalations, the collapsed part of the right chest suddenly sunk in and suddenly emerged. Combined with the previous symptoms of blue lips, distended carotid arteries, and difficulty breathing, Gretel immediately thought of one word. Tension pneumothorax. It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 28. Tension pneumothorax refers to the rupture of a large air bubble, or a large and deep lung laceration or bronchial rupture. The crack communicates with the pleural cavity and forms a one-way valve, also known as high-pressure pneumothorax. After the formation of tension pneumothorax, the intrapleural pressure decreases during inhalation, the valve opens, and gas enters the pleural cavity. During expiration, the intrapleural pressure increases, the valve closes, and gas cannot be discharged from the pleural cavity. The more you breathe, the higher the pressure in the pleural cavity becomes, tightly compressing the lungs. In the end, the lungs were completely compressed and could not be opened. No matter how hard the patient tried to breathe, he could not take a breath. This is one of the most fatal emergencies. Except for a knife on the carotid artery, or a ruptured aorta somewhere in the chest and abdomen, internal bleeding from other organs will not kill you as quickly. Death from suffocation only occurs in an instant. Priest. The temple of the god of war is indeed next to the military camp. It only takes 5 minutes at most to run there and back. However, The patient lying on the ground could not wait for 5 minutes. 50 ml syringe. Gretel shouted. No response. No one handed him anything. No syringes, no needles, no drains. No one knows what he wants, no one knows why he does this, no one even knows what the injured person's performance means. This is another world, not their hospital, not the emergency department where he has worked for more than 10 years. Greet looked up and around. There were anxious faces all around, staring at the patient, looking at the temple not far away, looking forward to the priest flying over. There are even people who are trying to tear down the door panels, use big shields, and want to lift the injured and take them to the temple. By the time you get the person there, he will be dead. Greet was anxious. He struggled to stand in front of the injured, opened one arm, and stretched the other arm forward to pull Flynn Knight. I'm a healer. I can save him. Captain, help me. Can you save him? Flynn Knight's steps immediately stopped. Greet nodded vigorously. He's dying. I can save him. I need something, Captain, help me. Flynn Knight hesitated. Greet had understood the healing technique. He had just heard about it from Captain Cullen, but no matter how much he trusted Cullen, hearing about it was nothing compared to seeing it with his own eyes. Besides, they have been able to see clearly the healing techniques of the God of War temple for decades. You look at his face. His face is purple, he can't breathe, he's dying. I can help him buy time. Wait until the priest comes. His tone became increasingly urgent. Flynn Knight stopped, stared at the injured on the ground, and looked at Gretel. This boy is telling the truth. Intuition told Flynn Knight so. However, the healing technique he just learned, and the 50-50 thing he mentioned, are they really useful? Captain believes him. Karen pushed through the crowd. At the same time, the injured struggles became more and more urgent and powerless. Flynn Knight made up his mind instantly. What would you like? Needle. Thick, hollow needle, Gretel answered without hesitation. It was his fault just now. Obviously no one could understand this damn place saying 50 ml syringe. Maybe, they didn't even have the concept of milliliters. Then the needle will do the trick. Hollow thick needle. He got a shake of the head. Greet is not discouraged. Then just thin steel pipes? No. Iron. Copper. Any hard pipe will do. It's as thick as your little finger. Yes. Someone finally reacted and ran away. After a moment, he turned back and handed Greet a very familiar stick that he had just used the day before yesterday. Chicken legs and bones. Gretel. Have I been involved in chicken bones these past 2 days? The key is that the day before yesterday was a cricothyroidotomy. He was holding a chicken bone and he could poke it indirectly. Today it was a thoracentesis and decompression. There was no syringe or needle, and he was holding a chicken bone that was dozens of times thicker than the needle. Want him to poke it in the chest? You think I am Superman? Greet roared inwardly. There is nothing you want, and this surgery is nothing. I hope the priests from the temple can come quickly, otherwise he won't even be able to suppress the infection. Give me the dagger. Quick. Greet stabbed out the midclavicular line on the right side, in the second intercostal space, without hesitation. Stab, stab, can't get in. Are the warriors, or knights, of this world so physically strong? Someone help me, Gretel shouted. He measured it with his little finger. As long as, so deep. Pierce it in. Pull it out, and then insert the chicken leg bone inside. I come. Knight Flynn took the dagger without hesitation. The knife goes in, the knife comes out, and the chicken leg bone is inserted. Huge pressure instantly erupted from the center of the leg bone with a hissing sound. Success. Greet's whole body relaxed. He knelt on one knee beside the injured man, watching his breathing and listening to the sound of airflow in the chicken bones. Put your thumb on the top of the chicken leg bone, sometimes pressing it tightly and sometimes letting it go. After thoracic decompression, an external one-way valve device should be connected so that high-pressure gas in the thoracic cavity can be easily discharged and external air cannot easily enter the thoracic cavity. In emergencies, older doctors used surgical gloves, soft plastic bags or balloons to cut a small opening and put it on the needle handle to replace the valve. Gretel didn't even have surgical gloves, so he could only use his thumbs to push up, and he mastered the rhythm on the spot. As he moved, the bulge on the injured man's right chest gradually subsided, and his expression softened a lot unconsciously. Anyone can see that this life has been pulled back from the gate of hell. Rescued. Rescued. It seems like I've really been saved. I remember that old Sieke also died in this way. His ribs were broken by a hammer, and he died within a short time. The priest hadn't even arrived yet. The onlookers were talking a lot. Flynn Knight's eyes looked at Gretel much softer, and he took the initiative to ask him. Little Greet, what should we do next? Next. Insert drainage tubes, perform closed chest drainage, take x-rays, straighten the ribs, and if you are unlucky, you need to open the chest to repair the lungs. But now it's useless. I can't do any of these jobs. Gretel rolled his eyes inwardly. Well, if in modern times, the emergency department is too busy, just leave it to cardiothoracic surgery. Now in another world, then, call a priest? A large number of chaotic footsteps finally sounded. Gretel's eyes were slightly sideways, and the surrounding area had become shorter. Everyone saluted and bowed their heads. Your Majesty Bishop. Your Majesty Bishop. Gretel turned his head and looked curiously. As for the salute, since he was kneeling next to the injured person now, he was already half shorter, so he didn't need to bother with it again. Surrounded in the middle was a muscular middle-aged man, with big shoulders and a round waist, and a big, shiny head. If you remove the western features of the high nose and deep eyes, just this bald head, some people would believe it was Lusitian. There is also a shield embroidered on the chest of the white robe, but it is not dark brown, but outlined with brilliant silver thread. On the shield, there is a war hammer, a scepter, and a cross. No other accessories. Only Chabot held a scepter in his big fist, with a few gems inlaid on the top, indicating the noble status of the bishop. Surrounding the bishop, there were 7 or 8 priests, tall and short, all of them muscular men who looked more like warriors than clergymen. The young priest John, whom Gretel knew, was also among them. He was the youngest and the smallest in diameter, so he could only be a priest's apprentice. A group of people gathered around the bishop and came to the injured person. The bald bishop first looked at the injured, and the second time he looked at Greet and the chicken bones in Greet's hand. Observe for a moment and smile slightly. Child, I'm here, you and your dash, pointing to the chicken bones, the responsibility can end. Gretel smiled back. His tone was courteous, but also calm, firm, and without thinking. You should treat it first. I will pull it out when the time is right. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right? Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 29. Chapter 29. The healing technique is so useful, I envy it. GIF. Little Gretel. Captain Cullen scolded softly. Captain Flynn took a step forward, as if he wanted to block Gretel behind him. All around, the soldiers of the city guard were whispering in surprise. The young priest John whispered. He immediately covered his mouth with both hands, but his eyes were glistening, looking at Gretel and then at the bald bishop. Every freckle on her little face is full of worry. The bald bishop was greatly surprised. He looked up and down, looking at Greet carefully, from the burlap waistcoat he wore like the others, to his right hand that was holding the chicken bone, to his left hand that was holding the injured man's wrist, with his fingertips resting on the pulse. After pondering for a moment, he asked carefully, "Kid, do you know what you're doing?" "I know." "Then do you know how injured this person is and how he needs to be treated?" "Severe blow to the chest, more than one rib was broken, and each rib was broken in more than one place." "One rib pierced the lung," Gretel answered without hesitation. "The ribs need to be straightened," rejoined, "and the damaged ones repaired." "Lungs and pleura. My healing skills can't be that strong, please." "As well as blood pressure adjustment, mediastinal repositioning, and displaced lung repositioning. Of course, after one treatment, the lungs are repaired and you can breathe normally. The mediastinum and lungs should be able to move back slowly on their own." "I won't follow you," said. "Then what are you doing holding this thing?" "Keep the air pressure in the chest balanced," Greet thought to himself. "However, if you really want to explain it to the other party like this, don't you have to draw an anatomy diagram first and then spend 10 minutes explaining clearly what air pressure is? If the other party can't understand it and has to do another Heidelberg experiment or something, that would be too confusing." "Brother, people are waiting to be rescued." It's a long story." Greet blinked desperately. "You cure him first, and then I can explain it to you slowly. Don't worry, I'm here and I won't run away." Okay. I'll listen to you later." The bald bishop laughed happily. He stopped asking, clasped his hands on his chest, lowered his head and murmured. This prayer took countless times longer than the little priest's healing spell. Greet felt that it took at least 10 minutes. While listening to the injured's breathing and pressing the chicken bones to maintain pressure balance, he secretly sweated. "Fortunately, I refused to let go. If this person were left to be treated by you, he would be suffocated to death by the time you finish chanting the healing technique." The bishop's actions were indeed extraordinary. After the singing ended, what fell was not a ray of white light, but a pattering of milky white light rain, which actually looked a little gentle. As the light rain fell, the injured man's chest immediately swelled, his muscles stretched apart, and his ribs reset, as if a pair of invisible hands were pulling and squeezing. Breathing also became smoother. After a while, he took a sharp breath and began to cough up bloody phlegm. Greet raced against time to pull out the chicken bones. As expected, the light rain dripped gently, and the wound stabbed with the dagger disappeared in the blink of an eye. "The treatment is really convenient." Greet was sincerely envious. If he had had this thing in his previous life, there would be no need for the patient to have an oxygen tube in his mouth and a drainage bottle hanging on his body. He would have to check the drainage volume every now and then. If he found something was wrong, he would call someone immediately. If there are 3 or 5 such patients in one night, just keep an eye on them all night, and forget about doing sit-ups. The effects of the treatment are immediate. As soon as the bald bishop's healing technique stopped, the previously seriously injured Knight Zero put his hands on the ground and turned over to stand up. He took 2 deep breaths, enjoyed the sweetness of the air, and immediately bowed his head and saluted. "Thank you to the great god of war. Thank you to the great god of war." The city guard soldiers and Ares priests present prayed together. Gretel lowered his head reflexively and clasped his hands together. "I just wanted to imitate others in praying, but suddenly I remembered that my character is a person who has been inspired by the god of nature. What seems wrong with thanking the god of war? I feel like an outlier." Gretel's mind was racing, thinking hard about how to prevent himself from being burned to death. On the other side, the bald bishop finally accepted Knight Zero's gratitude, stepped forward with a smile, and pulled Grey to the knight. "Actually, you should thank this young man more. If it hadn't been for him, we might have been too late by the time we arrived." Knight Zero breathed a sigh of relief. He had difficulty breathing before, but he was not unconscious. He still knew what was happening around him. He listened to Gretel's shouts, arguments, and calls for help. After being stabbed in the chest, breathing became smoother, and that was immediately noticeable. But, in front of the bishop of the God of War temple, he first went to thank a new recruit of the city guard. Was it because he didn't want to mess around, or did he not want the kid to mess around? Fortunately, the bishop spoke. Knight Zero turned around and grabbed Gretel. "That's what I just wanted to say. Little Gretel, thank you so much." "Nothing. This is what I should do," Gretel answered expertly. His tone was calm and his expression was indifferent, just like when he saved patients' lives countless times in his previous life and accepted the thanks from patients and their families. However, Knight Zero was slightly stunned for a moment. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Gretel carefully. When he spoke again, his address and tone had all changed to a tone of reciprocity. "Thank you, Greet. Well, please come to my house tonight and let me express my gratitude." "Well, that's not necessary, these are all things I should do." Gretel tried his best to refuse, and Knight Zero thanked and invited him again and again. The bald bishop watched with a smile for a while, then suddenly his expression straightened. He turned to the little priest John, who was next to the end of the team, and passed by. "John, is this the young healer you're talking about?" Greet was stunned and looked at John quickly. Little Freckles nodded desperately at him, grinning with a big smile on his face. Then, he made another face and pouted in the direction of the spring goddess temple. Greet felt warm in her heart. The Roman knight returned seriously injured, clearly leaving behind a disaster. Although he was ruined, the relationship in the family was not ruined. Who knows whether he will hold a grudge against himself, and who knows whether he will take revenge. Of course, he couldn't do it even if Gretel borrowed a knife to kill people and the necromancers were killed. After all, he was still a law-abiding citizen in his previous life. So Captain Cullen immediately took himself back to the military camp and reported to his superiors. Now it seems that Little John has also reported this matter to the Temple of the God of War, and it seems that he also wants to seek shelter and protection for himself. Gretel nodded gratefully to Little John. The bald bishop saw all their interactions, and instead of getting to the bottom of things on the spot, he made an invitation. "Hello, young healer. What you did just now is very interesting. We have also encountered many warriors who unfortunately died without treatment. Can you tell us in detail the method you used?" "Sure," Gretel answered without thinking. "It's not that difficult to open a hospital in another world, right?" Author, Geoland 2020. Chapter 30. Since it is a lecture, naturally it cannot be piled up on the playground. Captain Leon Knight raised his hand and invited him politely. The bald bishop agreed with a smile and walked towards the meeting hall of the military camp together. The priests followed suit. Greet fell back a few steps, trailing at the end, and came together with the little pastor John. The little priest immediately came over and said urgently in a low voice, "I told the bishop." "What about the knight?" "Yes," the little pastor nodded quickly. Gretel smiled and patted his shoulder hard. "Thanks." The meeting hall of the city guards was neither too big nor too small. There was a long table in the middle. The wooden board on the tabletop was obviously split from a whole tree trunk. It was not even painted except for being plain smooth. There is a map of Boss hanging on the wall opposite the door. If we squeeze around, about 20 people can sit down. The bald bishop and the captain of the city guard entered first. 7 or 8 pastors rushed in and immediately filled the conference room half full. Gretel was sandwiched between the 4 squadron leaders and followed naturally. The squad leaders and soldiers behind also wanted to squeeze in. The squadron leader at the end glared at them and was about to close the door, etc. Flynn Knight stopped it just in time. He glanced at Gretel and saw that the young man kept looking back. He couldn't help but smile and wave to Captain Cullen, who failed to squeeze in. "Karen, come and listen too." There was a small commotion in the crowd. The soldiers who were not allowed to push each other and complained half-jokingly. "Captain, this isn't fair." "Captain, we want to hear it too." "Captain, this is a way to save lives." Captain Cullen moved forward amidst the envy of his comrades. Greet looked left and right, and saw Brother Raymond and the others far away in the crowd at the entrance of the hall. It was really hard to squeeze in. After thinking about it, he turned to look for the captain. "Captain, what I'm going to talk about is very useful to everyone. It can help everyone try to save their lives when they are injured. Do you think you can?" He moved his palm outward. "Get a bigger place." "That must be possible." The captain naturally agreed, and the bald bishop had no objections. A group of people left the meeting hall and moved to the hall. Before anyone arrived, the smell of hot food was already drifting from the direction of the hall. Gretel's stomach growled twice. How could he forget that the largest room in the city guard is the hall when ceremonies are held, and it is usually the dining room. The soldiers and priests sat down to listen to the lecture, and Gretel stepped onto the podium without hesitation. There was no blackboard or chalk, so he made do with the simplicity and made vague gestures on himself. "We use our lungs to breathe. When the lungs work, they are like bellows for burning fire. When you open the bellows, you inhale, and when you push it out, you exhale. Once the lungs are damaged, they sometimes form a one-way movement. The valve all leaks into the chest when inhaling, and cannot be exhaled when exhaling." He explained as simply as possible how tension pneumothorax came about and how to deal with it during first aid. Before the bald bishop could ask more questions, his tone dropped and he sped up. "On the battlefield, there are many reasons for death. However, in addition to being killed immediately, many of them are seriously injured and cannot be treated by a priest in time. Now, I will talk about what kind of injuries should be treated first aid." The soldiers are refreshed. The squad leaders and ordinary soldiers were especially excited. As noble knights and the backbone of the battlefield, captains and squadron captains always find it easier to get treatment. The same cannot be said for civilians like them. Sometimes, a small cut on the hand of a noble master is more important than their broken hands and legs. He can obviously survive. Some comrades can survive if they receive timely treatment. Little Greet is pretty good. Next to Captain Cullen, a squad leader touched his arm and whispered. Like his father, another squad leader added. "That's right, the captain was like this back then, trying his best to take care of us." A group of middle-aged men were talking in low voices, looking at Gretel with eyes filled with admiration and nostalgia. Gretel nodded to them and said in one breath, "There are many reasons for death on the battlefield. The most important ones can be classified into three types. First, excessive bleeding; second, cardiac arrest; third, inability to breathe. Let's first talk about how to survive quickly on the battlefield. Stop bleeding." There was a commotion in the hall. Heart arrest and inability to breathe, in the eyes of the soldiers, are basically serious injuries that will lead to death, or they can basically be judged to be dead. When this happens, most people's first reaction is to give up. There is only blood. How many people watched helplessly as their comrades around them bled, unable to hold them down or stop them? In the end, he became weaker and weaker, and closed his eyes forever. Little Greet wants to talk about how to stop bleeding? Very good. Wait a minute. Suddenly, 2 or 3 voices shouted at the same time. Everyone looked around and saw 2 squadron leaders sitting in the second row jumping up and down. Little Greet, please speak slowly first. Let's get some paper and take notes. There was a sudden silence in the hall. Then, burst into laughter. Gretel couldn't help but laugh. He waved his hand to Flynn Knight, who jumped up, trying hard to tighten his muscles to prevent himself from laughing. Uncle Flynn, help me get 2 large pieces of paper and a board to hang them up. I need to draw some pictures for what I'm going to talk about next, so I can see clearly with the pictures dash. He drew pictures with his hands and explained with his mouth. From time to time, he would also find people to come up and give bandaging demonstrations. Everyone listened in rapt attention. When it was time for dinner, bread and bacon were brought from the kitchen, and everyone had a meal of vegetable soup and continued to listen. Just after he finished talking about how to stop bleeding on the head and arms, a noise sounded in the distance. Getting closer and bigger. Greet looked up and looked out the hall door, and at the same moment, several knights suddenly stood up, pressed their swords and turned their heads. Who? Who? Team, captain. Boom boom boom, a series of footsteps. Outside the ajar door of the hall, a city guard soldier ran in as if he was desperate, holding onto the door and wheezing. Captain, the city lord's mansion is here to arrest someone. What? What happened? The city lord's palace is arresting people. How come they caught our city guards here? There was a burst of noisy discussion in the hall. More than 100 city guard soldiers whispered to each other, either shocked or angry, or confused. Some people were even confused and blurted out. Aren't we the ones doing the job of arresting people? Puff. Greet stood firmly on the podium. At this time, the city lord's palace came to arrest people. He could roughly guess why, and sure enough, the door burst open. A well-dressed messenger led 2 guards and walked into the hall arrogantly. According to the order of the temple, Gretel Nordmark was summoned to ask questions.